Before America was even a dream, Florida was already fighting for its life. Not with muskets or armies, but with storms, with strangers, and with stories written in blood and fire. This wasn't just land. It was a battleground, a prize, a graveyard, and it would become one of the most unpredictable, influential, and misunderstood places in all of American history. The Florida you know today, the beaches, the palm trees, the theme parks, the retirement homes, none of that existed when the first eyes stared across its wild shores. What they saw wasn't sunshine. They saw something raw, untamed, and pulsing with danger. In 1513, a Spanish explorer named Juan Ponce de Leon sailed through the warm waters of the Atlantic and saw a land bursting with green. He thought it was an island. He was wrong. He called it La Florida, the land of flowers. But what he found here wasn't paradise. It was resistance. It was mystery. It was war. The native tribes who lived here didn't roll over for flags or names. The Calusa controlled the southern coasts like a navy without ships, fierce, organized, and ready to fight. The Timucua dominated the northern forests. The Appalachee farmed the panhandle and built complex societies long before Europe even knew the Americas existed. These were not scattered people. They were nations. And they were not going to surrender. But Europe didn't care. Spain had tasted gold in the Caribbean. Now they wanted to anchor their empire with a foothold in North America. Florida was going to be that anchor. The Spanish wanted it not because of what it was, but because of where it was. If they could hold Florida, they could guard the shipping lanes that poured silver and gold from South America back to Spain. So, in 1565, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés landed near the Matanzas River and built St. Augustine, oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what would become the United States. But the founding of St. Augustine wasn't a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a massacre. The French had already tried to colonize nearby. They were Protestants, and Spain Catholic and proud saw them as heretics. Menéndez slaughtered them at Matanzas Inlet. Hundreds dead, no mercy, no apologies. This was the true birth of Florida's European history: conquest, religion, empire, and blood. For 2 centuries, Spain clung to Florida like a sword with a broken handle, sharp, dangerous, but hard to control. The British eventually seized it in 1763 after the 7 Years' War, then lost it again to Spain in 1783. Meanwhile, native peoples suffered. Disease, warfare, and slavery shattered entire nations. But from those ashes rose new ones. The Seminoles were born from fragments descendants of Creek Indians, free black people, and runaway slaves. They found refuge in the dense interior of Florida, where few dared follow. But the United States was growing fast, and Florida was in the way. American settlers, hungry for land, began to spill into Spanish Florida, triggering chaos. Slaves fled south to escape bondage. U.S. troops pursued them across the border. Florida was becoming a lawless zone, and in 1817, General Andrew Jackson invaded it without formal approval. He torched villages, executed leaders, and proved one thing: the U.S. was ready to take Florida by force. Spain, weakened and overstretched, gave up. In 1819, the Adams-Onis Treaty handed Florida over to the United States. But the ink on that treaty didn't bring peace. It brought war again. The United States wanted the Seminoles out. They wanted the land. And so began the Second Seminole War, of the most brutal, costly, and relentless conflicts in U.S. history. Osceola, a charismatic Seminole leader, became the face of resistance, but even he couldn't stop the tide. He was captured under a false flag of truce and died in prison. Thousands of Seminoles were killed or forced west, but some never surrendered. They melted into the Everglades, and their descendants remain to this day unconquered. As the blood dried, settlers came. Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821. By 1845, it was granted statehood. But it didn't join the Union for peace. It joined for power. And when the Civil War broke out, Florida sided with the Confederacy. It was the third state to secede. While battles raged elsewhere, Florida served a darker purpose, supplying Confederate troops with beef, salt, and support. After the war, Florida lay in ruin. Slavery was abolished, but racism and poverty remained. Reconstruction offered hope, but that hope was quickly strangled by segregation and violence. For Black Floridians, freedom came with chains of a different kind: Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and economic exploitation. And then, something began to change. A whisper, a spark, a vision: railroads. Men like Henry Flagler and Henry Plant saw something others didn't. They saw that Florida could be transformed not into farmland, but into fantasy. They laid tracks through swamps, forests, and mosquito-infested marshes. They built hotels that gleamed like palaces. They marketed paradise, palm trees, breezes, wealth, escape. Cities like Tampa, Miami, and Palm Beach were born in this wave of steel and vision. People came by the thousands, then the millions. Some came for opportunity, some for health, some just for sun. But Florida didn't come quietly into prosperity. In 1926, a massive hurricane slammed into Miami. Thousands were left homeless. Then, in 1928, a storm ripped across Lake Okeechobee, drowning over 2,500 people, mostly poor Black laborers. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in U.S. history. And yet, Florida still grew. Florida was bruised, but it wasn't broken. Even after nature screamed through its cities and lives were lost by the thousands, people didn't leave. They rebuilt. And somehow, the myth of Florida only grew stronger. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, and while the entire nation struggled, Florida did something strange: it adapted. It sold itself not just as a place to survive, but a place to escape. As America wilted under the weight of unemployment and despair, Florida offered warmth, sunlight, hope. Tourists were fewer, but they still came. The land, cheap and open, became a haven for new ideas. And when World War II broke out, Florida's location once again made it invaluable, not for treasure fleets this time, but for training soldiers. Thousands of men learned to fly in the Florida skies. Naval bases, airstrips, and military schools popped up like brush fires. The war transformed the state into a strategic hub. And when the war ended, something unexpected happened. The soldiers stayed. Men who trained under Florida's sun returned from the trenches of Europe and the Pacific and remembered the heat on their skin, the sound of palms swaying in the breeze. They brought their families. They bought land. They built lives. And suddenly, Florida wasn't just a vacation spot. It was home. The 1950s arrived with highways and suburbs. Air conditioning, once a luxury, became a necessity, and it changed everything. It meant people could finally live in Florida year-round, not just survive it. Entire cities expanded overnight. Retirees came in waves. Developers couldn't build fast enough. It was a modern-day land rush. Only this time, it wasn't pioneers with wagons. It was families with Chevrolets and pensions. But even as Florida boomed, it wrestled with itself. Because beneath the sunshine, storms still brewed: social, cultural, racial. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement swept across America, Florida became a battleground once again, this time for equality. Black Floridians marched, protested, sat in at lunch counters, demanded justice. In St. Augustine, In Miami and Tallahassee, civil rights leaders faced arrest, intimidation, violence. But they kept marching. And Florida, like the rest of the South, was forced to change. Schools were desegregated. Jim Crow laws began to fall. But the scars remained, and in many ways, they still do. Then, in 1965, something happened that would alter Florida's future forever. Not a law, not a war, but a whisper in Walt Disney's imagination. Walt Disney, already a legend, had a vision. He didn't just want a bigger Disneyland. He wanted something more radical. A city, a future, a kingdom, and he wanted it in Florida. Quietly, his company bought tens of thousands of acres of swamp and brushland near a sleepy town called Orlando. They used fake names to keep it secret, avoiding price hikes. By the time the truth came out, Disney had already bought enough land to build a world. When Walt Disney World opened in 1971, it didn't just change Orlando, it changed the planet. Suddenly, Florida was no longer just beaches and old folks. It was fantasy. A place where dreams were designed with concrete, fireworks, and animatronics. Families came by the millions. Highways expanded. Hotels exploded. Orlando became a global brand. And while Disney ruled the center of the state, another Florida icon began to rise along the coast, Cape Canaveral, later renamed the Kennedy Space Center. As the Cold War intensified and the U.S. battled the Soviet Union for space supremacy, Florida became the launchpad for mankind's greatest ambitions. From these shores, rockets roared into the heavens, astronauts kissed the sky, and in 1969, when Neil Armstrong took that one small step, the thunder that launched him echoed from Florida's soil. Florida had become something more than a state. It had become a symbol of wonder, of escape, of American dreams made real. But the story doesn't end there, because dreams always have a price. The 1980s brought prosperity, but also problems. Florida, especially South Florida, became the epicenter of a new kind of cocaine wars. Drug cartels from Latin America funneled billions of dollars of cocaine into the U.S. through Miami. Violence surged. Entire neighborhoods became war zones. Miami became known as the murder capital of America. Shows like Miami Vice glamorized it, but on the ground, it was chaos. Corruption infected police departments. Drug lords lived in mansions. Shootouts happened in broad daylight. And yet, even in this chaos, Florida kept growing. Cubans fleeing Fidel Castro's regime had already come in droves during the Mariel boat lift in 1980. Over 100,000 refugees arrived on Florida's shores. They came poor, but hungry for freedom. And they helped transform Miami into the beating heart of Latin America in the U.S. The city became bilingual, multicultural, electric. Spanish echoed in every neighborhood. Salsa spilled from every club. It was messy, yes, but it was also magic. By the 1990s, Florida had become one of the most diverse states in the country. Haitians, Dominicans, Venezuelans, Colombians, Puerto Ricans, Brazilians all brought their culture, their food, their rhythm. Florida was no longer just a southern state. It was a global state. And with that growth came power. Florida's population exploded. With it came congressional clout, political influence, and something else, uncertainty. Because Florida had become what no one expected, a swing state. A place that could decide the future of the United States. And then it happened. The year was 2000. The presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore came down to just one state, Florida. The vote was so close, it triggered a recount. Then lawsuits. Then chaos. The world watched as terms like hanging chads and butterfly ballots became household phrases. Protesters clashed. Judges ruled. And in the end, it was the U.S. House protesters and greeted Supreme Court that decided the winner. By just 537 votes, George W. Bush won Florida and the presidency. Once again, Florida had determined the fate of the nation, not with muskets or ships this time, but with paper, with people, with power. And that power only grew. Florida became the third most populous state in America, behind only California and Texas. Its cities Orlando, Miami, Tampa, Jacksonville boomed. Construction cranes became part of the skyline. Tourists poured in year-round. Retirement communities blossomed like never before. But Florida has always walked a tightrope between dream and disaster. And in the 21st century, that balance became more fragile than ever. It's the contradiction that defines Florida paradise perched on the edge of peril. One minute, it's sunshine and palm trees. The next, it's sirens and boarded windows. The state's natural beauty has always come with a warning label, and no reminder is more sobering than hurricane season. In 2004 and 2005, Florida was slammed by one of the most brutal back-to-back hurricane barrages in its history. Names like Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Jean became part of the daily vocabulary. Cities were shredded, millions lost power, insurance markets crumbled. And then came Katrina Note, a direct hit on Florida, but a monster that proved how fragile coastal life could be. Later, Irma, Michael, and Ian would each leave their scars. In every storm, Floridians learned what their ancestors already knew, that in this state, you don't control the land, you survive it. Yet somehow, Florida always bounces back. Maybe it's the weather, maybe it's the people, maybe it's the dream. Because even as sea levels rise and hurricanes grow stronger, more people move to Florida every year. Why? The answer is more than sun. Florida is freedom, sometimes messy, sometimes maddening, but always magnetic. The state's politics reflect that chaos. It's the swing state that stopped swinging. For decades, Florida flipped back and forth between parties. But by the 2010s and 2020s, the political winds began shifting. Sharp debates over immigration, gun rights, healthcare, and education lit up the airwaves. And Florida became a national laboratory for controversial ideas, banning books, restricting voting, clashing over history in classrooms. Supporters called it leadership. Critics called it a warning. But no one ignored it. Then came 2020, the pandemic. Florida became a headline again. Crowded beaches, shut down protests, open-air restaurants, while other states locked down. Governor Ron DeSantis drew national attention for defying federal COVID guidelines. To some, he was a symbol of resistance. To others, a symbol of recklessness. But to everyone, Florida was front and center, loved, hated, and watched. As the country reeled from division, Florida became a mirror of the American soul-diverse, defiant, dangerous, and full of contradictions. Its cities swelled with new residents from New York, California, the Midwest. People fleeing taxes, cold weather, and political frustration found new hope in Florida's warm chaos. Real estate prices exploded. The skyline of Miami grew faster than ever before. Tech companies, investors, and influencers declared it the next big thing. Miami wasn't just a vacation, it was the future. But not everything glittered. Behind the skyline, cracks grew. Rising seas crept into streets. The Everglades, once wild and untouchable, shrunk as water was diverted to feed cities. Invasive species like the Burmese python ravaged ecosystems. Coral reefs bleached and died. And beneath it all, a quiet truth loomed. Florida was running out of time. It was beautiful. It was booming. But it was drowning. And yet people kept coming. Because Florida is a promise. Always has been. From the moment Ponce de Leon saw its green shores and named it the land of flowers, people have chased something here. Adventure, reinvention, escape. From the Calusa to the Spanish, from runaway slaves to snowbirds, from space cowboys to street racers, Florida has been the place you run to when you're ready to become something else. It's why writers like Hemingway and Zora Neale Hurston wrote their best work here. It's why Muhammad Ali trained here, why rock bands partied here, why presidents retire here, and why tourists still arrive by the millions, year after year, just to stand in the sun and feel free. Because Florida isn't just a place, it's a feeling, a mood, an idea. It's where the rules bend and time feels different. It's where you can wear shorts on Christmas and eat Cuban food next to a Confederate statue. It's a state where contradictions don't collide, they dance. And that's why its history matters. Because Florida didn't become what it is by accident. It became this wild, wonderful, unpredictable corner of the United States because it's always been both paradise and paradox. Its past is soaked in colonization, in slavery, in war, in ambition. Its future is still being written in classrooms, on voting ballots, in the roar of a rocket, and the silence of a street underwater. And maybe that's the real story. Florida isn't one story. It's 1,000. It's a refugee escaping Cuba, a retiree from Ohio, a rapper in Miami, a farmer in the Panhandle, a scientist at Cape Canaveral, a Seminole who never surrendered, a kid staring at the horizon, knowing that from here, anything is possible, even space. That's what makes Florida powerful. Not its beaches, not its theme parks, not its weather, but its people. Bold, strange, fearless people who keep building lives at the edge of disaster and doing it with style. So, if you've made it this far, if you've ridden the waves of history, seen the rise and fall, the storms and dreams of this strange, beautiful state called Florida, then do one more thing. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite Florida moment or place, and if you love diving into the hidden stories of America's past, don't forget to subscribe. Because here, history isn't just facts, it's alive, and we're just getting started.